Hello, my name's Fran Stovold and I would like to welcome you to the Sporting Heritage Conference 2022. This year we're running a series of conference webinars which will explore where the two spheres of sport and heritage intersect. In this session we will be focusing on where sport fits into the agendas of heritage organisations and how they've made it fit and become embedded in part of their work. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the chair for this session, Justine Reilly.
Thanks, Fran. So welcome everybody. I'm Dr Justine Reilly. I'm the Director of Sporting Heritage. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction of our work before I hand over to members of the panel. We are the Subject Specialist Network for sports across the 4 UK nations. We're a CIC, a social enterprise, and a membership organisation. And we exist to protect, preserve, provide access to and celebrate sporting heritage. And we do that in a number of different ways, working with organisations across heritage, sport, community, anywhere or anyone who's got a collection, whether that be physical objects, photographs, films, or histories or stories. We work to help people look after those collections, protect them and celebrate them. And we deliver a range of programming, including National Sporting Heritage Day, Sport and Art Month, the Sporting Heritage Awards, Community Grants Programme, and a national conference, which you're joining today, and a workforce development programme, and various other projects specific to the development of sporting heritage within the 4 nations, to share how important these collections are and where they fit within our cultural heritage. Over the last 3 years, since the beginning of COVID, we've had a massive change and shift in the way that the organisation works. We do a lot of digital delivery and activity, which has really helped to access different audiences and provide that support. And we exist really to make sure that we can shout about how important these collections are, network people together, and celebrate why they are important across all the different types of agendas. We have had impacts and outputs across lots of different funded programmes, for example, National Lottery Heritage Fund programmes, Sport England, Art Fund, and we deliver consultancy and services support where it's needed across the sector. And all of this is evidence that there is a massive impact of sporting heritage and the collections that we all have across agendas like the economy, health, education, tourism, well-being, lots of different ways that these collections are central to our community. And our next steps are embarking on a National Lottery Heritage Fund resilience programme to ensure that our organisation is really robust and fit for purpose into the future, so that we can make sure that we're delivering what all of you need and what the network and the sector need to make sure that sporting heritage collections are removed from risk and there and celebrated for the future. So that's what we do and what we're about, and it's brilliant to be able to be here and to share that work and bring together people who are out there delivering some amazing activity, to understand where the sector is at the moment and, crucially, what we need to do next. Where are the gaps and what do we need to do to support that? So I'm going to start by introducing today's panel. We'll have a little bit of time where we'll hear more about the panel's work and what they're doing, and then we'll have a discussion, as Fran was saying, about where is sport within heritage agendas. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Foteini, who's the curator at the Museum of London, who's doing some really exciting work. So Foteini.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm one of the curators at Museum of London. Museum of London is basically a history museum, a social history museum, telling the story of London from prehistory till now. We are in going through some exciting times at the museum. We are closing our current sites at London Wall in less than a month, so on the 4th of December. We are celebrating the closure with a very big party that everyone is welcome. The museum is going to be open for 48 hours. And this is also an exciting time for us to rethink our collections, to rethink our mission, and to rethink our audiences. This year, Museum of London has embarked on a wide sport program across the organization. So me and a colleague of mine are leading on this program that includes different strands of activity. This is a new thing for us, and I'm really excited to be, among people that have worked in sporting heritage collections longer than I have. The reason we picked sports is because we have a lot of gaps in our collection. We do have some historic objects that I can talk about later on, but through a lot of consultation sessions from different members of the community, we realized that sport should be more prominent in our collections and in the new museum. So this program includes different collecting projects. We're very much interested in collecting contemporary objects, contemporary stories. We're very much interested in collecting anything from grassroots football to capoeira and qigong in London. We're working with young people in London because we would like to document their experience of sport in London. And also with Sporting Heritage basically is doing an audience research for us to understand what the Londoners need from us for the new museum around sport. A piece of research that will inform our collection and will inform how we should do sport better in the new museum. That's all from me.
Oh, thanks so much. I mean, it's a really exciting work that you're delivering at the moment, and a real kind of sort of example of how big museums whose focus isn't on sport can be looking at developing what activity they're doing. So really exciting to learn more about what you're doing today. I'm going to hand over to Nick, who is the Football Museum Officer at Wrexham Heritage Services.
Hi everybody, thanks to Sporting Heritage for inviting me on the panel today. So my name is Nick Jones. I'm the Football Museum Officer based at Wrexham Museum in North Wales. So at the moment, Wrexham Museum is an existing museum which tells the history of the city and the local area. But we're embarking on an exciting new project where the museum is going to be redeveloped in the coming years. When it reopens, it's what we're terming a museum of two halves. So half of it will be a redeveloped Wrexham Museum, but the other half will become a football museum for Wales, for the whole of Wales. So in England and Scotland, there have been museums for those countries' football for quite a long time. So yeah, it was really pleasing to know that Wales is going to join the list in the coming years. So Wrexham is kind of tagged as the spiritual home of football in Wales. It's where the Football Association of Wales came into being. It hosts Wrexham AFC, who are the third oldest club in the UK and the oldest in Wales. And where they play, the racecourse ground is one of, if not the oldest international stadium still in use. So that's sort of why it's centred in Wrexham. But then it is very much the story of football for the whole of the country. So we need to obviously tell the story of the major clubs, and in the south, Cardiff and Swansea, Newport, but also right through to grassroots football. And the 6 FAs that are in place across Wales as well. So we're at the sort of development stage of the project at the moment, still trying to sort of secure the funding that's required, and then hoping to get sort of boots on the ground, as it were, in 2024 when the museum will close, to actually be redeveloped, and then with an aim of opening in 2025. So that's the project as it is at the moment. And then I guess just to say, the other part of my job would be, there's been a Welsh football collection at the museum for about 20 years, and it's sort of been displayed in small parts in temporary exhibitions over the last few years. But although it's quite a strong collection in some areas, it's definitely got gaps that need addressing. So that's sort of part of my job, and obviously feeding into the future museum, we're aiming to grow the collection in quite a few areas. So that's also a key part of my job going forward. Yeah, so that's me, and that's Wrexham Museum. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Nick. Yeah, exciting times with what's happening there, and I think what you're touching on again is going to be a theme that we may be discussing in a little bit. That kind of gap in collections of sport, because it's not been something that the museums and heritage sector has focused on in the past. So we're now all kind of going, we recognise now this is really important. How do we make sure we fill those gaps? So yeah, interested to talk about that in a moment as well. Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to hand over now to Helen Keogh, who is a museum freelancer, and it should be said, it was fundamentally important in the development of sport and heritage, whether she realises it or not.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on the panel today. I just wanted to, because I'm a museum freelancer, but I'll just give you a bit of a background as to why I'm on the panel today. I'm a freelancer in the Northwest, and I've worked in a number of different museums, but also before working back in the Northwest, I was a curator at Leeds United Football Club for 2 years. Which was a really, really interesting role, basically documenting their collection, categorizing it, and then moving it to more suitable storage, which was absolutely fascinating. I then returned there in 2019 to work on a freelance basis for their centenary celebrations. So we developed displays in the club itself, and then also in Leeds City Museum as well. But the big project that I've been involved in it's been over 2.5 years actually, because of COVID, has been a Sporting Heritage and the Armed Forces project, which has been the Army Museums Ogilvie Trust, which is the group of armed forces museums, and Sporting Heritage, a big project that they have been working on in partnership to try and rediscover the sporting heritage collections within these military museums, and that's been absolutely fascinating. So as I say, it's been going on for quite a long time. I initially started working on this in January 2020, and the museums that I've been working with are Cumbria's Museum of Military Life, Lancashire Infantry Museum, and the Fusilier Museum, as well as National Football Museum and Cumbria Archive Service. And the whole idea was to try and get out these sporting parts of these military collections and try and find out the impact that football has had on the army, but also the impact that the army has had on football. So it's been a really, really fascinating project. Due to COVID, it's kind of been very stop-start, but we kind of got back really into it earlier this year, and the exhibition is now on display in Carlisle at Cumbria's Museum of Military Life. So I'll just show you, this is the exhibition. It's called Tactics and Teamwork, Football in the British Army. And like I said, it's a collaborative exhibition which is going on display. So it's in Carlisle at the moment. It's going down to Bury, then it's coming back up to the Lancashire Infantry Museum in Preston, and then it's going to come back up to Carlisle Archives. So the military museums wanted to explore football in the collections out of all the sports for a number of reasons. Firstly, because there's lots of objects and archives in all these military collections. So often there are footballing trophies, footballing medals, and lots of pictures of the team. So it's really, really interesting to kind of focus on that, but also because of obviously football is the most popular sport in the world. In this country, there's such this fascination of both the men's and the women's game. And it's just been even more exciting this year with the success of the women's game as well. So the project has been all about kind of exploring all of these collections, working with the staff at each museum to try and pull together the really, really interesting stories. And football just it spans so many different eras. It's so interesting. So kind of thinking about football during British Empire, when the army were in lots of different places all around the world and kind of spreading the game, helping to spread the game around the world. football in the First and Second World War, the National Service era, which was also really fascinating, and then the impact of football on the army now, so things like communication, training. So it's been really, really useful also to work with the National Army Museum on this, and the Royal Army Physical Training Corps Museum as well, and the Army FA. So it's just been such a fascinating project to be part of. And I'm just going to move on. So it's a travelling exhibition, like I say, it's on display in Carlisle at the Military Museum at the moment. And it's another thing which I think we'll probably speak about later as well, is once an exhibition is on display, more stories come out. So there were serving soldiers that came to the opening of the exhibition that started telling us stories about when they were serving in Afghanistan and football games they played. And so there's oral histories and new information that has come from these stories, with this exhibition being on display. So just wanted to show you a couple of slides from the opening as well. So this is the thing, once you kind of start the ball rolling, it kind of goes on and on. So it's been really great to get the exhibition going, and look forward to hearing more feedback as to how how the museums have enjoyed having it on display. But also as well, I think something else we'll talk about, sorry, I'm really fish, is how important I think football is, because it's such a popular sport. I think one of the hopes of the museums involved in the project was that it might bring a new audience as well to the museums. So it's been really fascinating to be part of.
Oh, thank you so much, Helen. I mean, yeah, you've touched there on that importance of where sport, sometimes people just think, oh, they're just sporting collections, but actually they're important in and of themselves, but then they tell all this wider political, economic, all manner of different community and diverse stories that are so important, so many people in different ways. And definitely I think around the audiences, we'll touch on that again in a little while. So thank you. So I'm going to hand over to our last panel member now, Helena Smart from the National Archives, who's the development manager. Helena.
Hello, and thanks very much for inviting me on this panel today. So as Justine says, I'm the development manager for the National Archives, with a responsibility for national networks, including Sporting Heritage. I only took up this post in May, and this is my first event with Sporting Heritage, so be kind. So I see my responsibility in this role is to foster a really good relationship with the National Archives and the networks, hopefully for us to work together, to share information, to share better practice. That's what I see my key role as. It is a part-time role at the National Archives, and I also work as a practicing archivist and team leader at Liverpool Record Office. I'm based in Liverpool, and I've worked there for 20 years. So I do have a practical knowledge, which I'm hoping I can bring to the panel today, of sporting collections within a local authority archive setting. And that's probably where I'll sort of, talk quite a lot today rather than my TNA role. At Liverpool, we have a couple of major collections. We've got the Everton Football Club collection and St Helens Liverpool and St Helens Rugby Club, and I've been involved in both those deposits. Firstly with the Rugby Club, it was helping them secure funding from the Heritage Fund, sort of working through that process with them. And with the Everton Trust, it's been a bit more strategic, really. It's been a bit more about what are we going to do in the future to get this really key collection out there, because we have it, but it needs to be sort of known and worked with. So I've got, a range of experience that I'm hoping comes out today in the panel. Another area of focus in both my roles is I've got a real passion for community archives. I've worked with many community groups. I've helped a lot of them get to where they need to be in terms of funding, activities, curating exhibitions, preserving, cataloguing their collections. So I'm hoping, and I see a real synergy with sporting collections and these organisations which I work with. Something I'm hoping we can kind of talk about later on in the panel is I did work with a community organisation who curated a whole exhibition on black boxers in Liverpool, really, and it was just to see that level of engagement with a sort of local community. It was just, you know, phenomenal, and that exhibition was so successful that it travelled, and that was a purely community-led exhibition with very minimal involvement for any kind of professional organisation. So that to me was just wonderful. So I'm hoping we can talk about that type of work today as well. So yeah, again, just thanks for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, again, amazing stuff and experience that you're bringing today, and that kind of extra added experience around archives and archival work as well, which is central to the development and the delivery of sporting heritage. So yeah, I think the knowledge that you're going to bring to the panel is brilliant. So thank you everybody for introducing your work and what you're doing. It's brilliant to have such a good kind of breadth of knowledge and understanding here. So we've got a very short space of time to discuss, where is the sporting heritage? Where is it? And for me, it's fundamentally why we exist as an organisation, to really shout about the fact that sport should be central to what heritage organisations are doing if they're working with communities. So what I really wanted to ask the panel to begin with is, where do you think the sport is within heritage organisations? Do you think it is something that has traditionally been ignored and still is, or do you think that that's changing? Who would like to go first? Foteini.
I wanted to go first because, as I said before, this is a very new thing for me. So when I was doing my research before we embarked on this program, I could find very little in other museums and in other collections. And that's when I started thinking, where is sporting heritage? And I realized that myself, I had ignored it as part of our culture. And especially for Museum of London, which is a city that has a very rich history and long tradition in sports, the only city that has hosted 3 times the Olympics so far, major sporting events from London Marathon to UEFA Women's Euro Cup. But also sport is played in every neighborhood, park and street. So it was quite surprising to see the lack of objects in our collections, but in other national collections, something that is, you know, part of, you know, the DNA of the city, but also of the country as well. I think that I see a shift because recently I've seen, you know, a few exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, but they have started, you know, popping up in other organizations, which I think is a good sign. But also what I feel is that museums have started rethinking their collections in terms of their audiences and objects that, you know, they can put on display to create these personal narratives and personal connections. Sport is a common denominator across the society, across, you know, backgrounds and genders and age, and it's a global language, like everybody, you know, speaks sport. So in this shift of making more representative displays and, you know, permanent galleries in our museums, I feel that this is where sport comes in. Like, everyone has some sort of a story, some sort of a connection with sports, and it's something that has, you know, a global impact almost.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to ask the rest of you to come back in as well, but I mean, you're touching there on things of the fact that it hasn't happened, you know, that there are some really excellent examples, you said, where sport exists within the heritage sector, but I expect to be able to go into any local authority museum and see sport because it's central to every town and city, but it isn't there. Or where it is there, it's sporadic and it's largely been driven by a curator who's had a real knowledge that this is either going to be really interesting to their community or they've got a real passion in sport. And it feels sometimes like it's a little bit ad hoc, whether that happens or not, and that audience driver. So anyone else on the panel like to come back in their thoughts? Helen?
Yeah, I was going to say, with the military museums that I'd worked with, I think sport is a big part of being in the army, these 3 army museums that I've been working with. And so there are items on displays. But I think with the football exhibition that we've been working on, it was a really great opportunity to kind of bring that to the forefront. So there were things in the permanent galleries and sport has been represented, but like it's great to kind of have a lot more of a focus on that. And I think with the temporary exhibitions, that is the way to kind of to do it, isn't it? It's a way of getting like more press and publicity and kind of introducing it to a different audience that then go perhaps into the rest of the museum, the different galleries. But yeah, I do completely see what you're saying, Foteini, because it's definitely something that I think seems to be becoming more of a thing, that there is sport, but like you say, if there's a passionate curator or somebody who has that kind of particular interest, but I think that's something that's going to become more and more.
Thanks, Helen. And I mean, the Sport and the Army project came because what we'll sometimes do is look at where is there a gap that isn't being represented, and how do we as a subject specialist network help to support that, and having that focus on specific collections area, because there's such a breadth of what are we looking at in terms of sport, so many different sports, and that sometimes it is helpful to have that kind of focus, I think. And it's brilliant to see that that has worked for those museums, and hopefully we'll shift it going forward. And I'm thinking, Nick, in terms of the conversation that we're having here, I suppose this has been like kind of a central discussion that's led to the development of the football museum project in many ways.
Yeah, I think where I'm with it is I think there are, as you touched on just before, Justin, I think there are lots of really good sort of isolated examples across the UK, but it's not as widespread as perhaps we'd like to see it at the moment. So certainly in football, which is kind of the area I'm in and the most sort of popular sport, there are only a sort of handful of clubs that have their own museums, for example, and they tend to be the bigger clubs that perhaps have the money to invest in them. But I think frustration can be with it, again, with quite a lot of the clubs in football, is that they do maybe have some displays of collections, but it can often be sort of hidden. You can have them in sort of hospitality areas, or even sort of directors areas where only a handful of people get to see them, really. And it's getting clubs to kind of really value and promote their heritage. I think there's an element of some clubs can use it on occasion when it kind of works with something they're doing, but don't always sort of invest in it in the way they should. And I think, but the flip side of that is that there's so much stuff done by volunteers around the games, and so much kind of heritage stuff happening there, which is fantastic. But you'd like to sort of join that up a little bit more with the clubs and the organisations than perhaps happens at the moment, I'd say. And then certainly from a national museum basis, I was going to say that I think having kind of clubs in England or in Wales that do sort of work with local museums is a fantastic thing. So if you have a club that perhaps doesn't have the space to make a display, if they can really try and work with their local museum, I think it's a two-way thing. They then have somewhere to have their collections on display, but also I think that can really push visitors to local museums and new audiences, perhaps. And also thinking about our project at the moment, one of the great challenges is we want to include as much of Welsh football as we can, but we can't include every club and every story. So having these local museums and clubs maybe working together across the country means that if you come to the National Museum, perhaps there might not be so much on your club, but actually in your hometown, in your home museum, there is that, there is that content, perhaps.
Oh, thanks, Nick. I mean, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it? If you've then got that link between the National Museum and local museums that are sort of forever shifting the story and the dialogue, so that you're always contemporary collecting and making sure that you've got really current stories that are meeting what your audiences are looking for. That'd be brilliant. And Helena, in terms of archives, yeah, where does this fit for your experience?
Yeah, I do still think in the archive sector, perhaps there's not really an awareness of how sport and collections can fit with these other agendas, or, as you mentioned earlier, the sort of well-being agenda or community engagement, because it does take a bit more thinking out the box. I think there's still a tendency perhaps to think, community engagement, looking at collections that have been curated by the community, or if you were thinking about well-being, about thinking the more traditional sources for that. Whereas sporting collections can hit all those markers. So I do think there's quite a lot of education work needs to be done, certainly, and that's my experience. I just think people are not quite sure, perhaps, about how they can tease this out of sporting collections. And just on another note, I think, certainly in the local authority sectors, I think there's a tendency to engage with the people that approach us, so people with funded projects. So, rather than being more kind of proactive. So perhaps if sporting organisations are not approaching, your local authority archive, that there's not going to be a synergy to work together. It's just not on their kind of radar, if I'm not going to put that in a different way. But yeah, I just think there's barriers there to sort of capacity and working with funded projects, who can bring in a team of people to do that work. But, yeah.
I mean, capacity is a massive issue, isn't it? And we work across both the sport and the heritage sectors, and a lot of our work is trying to match together and supporting the sporting sector with understanding how to look after collections, and a big plug for our toolkit developed by the wonderful Fran, that really is trying to support those organisations to do that, and look after their collections themselves, because the museum and heritage sector are starting to wake up to the fact that these collections deliver a lot of their agendas, but they don't have any, or if they do, they're not quite sure of what those stories tell, or they're not using them in that way. And the specialists exist outside of the sector often, so we need to ensure that there's that join up. So Foteini, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, I really like your point, Helena, about sporting heritage is not just one collection. There are like different ways of looking at it. And of course, on the one hand, we have like the more, official or, known stories of, the clubs or, very popular, sport like football, that, we're kind of like aware. Of course, there should be, a lot of thinking around, preserving these stories. But I am personally very interested in, the hidden stories and, the unheard voices within the sporting heritage. So either, different types of sport that, they're not that popular, but, they're pillars of, different communities, and, they bring, these communities together. So I'm interested, in sporting icons, for example, but not only the famous ones, but, the the local heroes that, you know, inspired and, you know, empowered other people to, you know, around sports. I'm interested in sporting subcultures, for example. There's a lot there that I want to unpick. And I don't know, it's, yeah, I think like working with the community, because, you know, sport is experienced so differently from like different people, will make a difference, I think, in the way we're collecting. Also, I feel that this is a very good way of diversifying our collections as well. Again, different sports are supported by different communities, and probably there is something there that, you know, we could attract and include and represent all different communities out there in these collections.
Oh, I mean, absolutely agree with everything you're saying there, Foteini. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've spent quite a lot of time looking at diversifying what's known about sporting heritage, because just like the rest of the heritage sector, it's been predominantly, when sport is looked at, it's predominantly still traditional in its way of being reflected, white, able-bodied, straight men largely. And there are so many stories that exist that tell other stories that are just hidden or ignored. And we did a big project working with sports governing bodies, and some of the people were working on that were amazing. Again, like you're saying, Nick, volunteers and lots of brilliant activity happening. And when we were asking people about collections, if they did have any development on collections, it was largely those collections. And we'd say, that's brilliant, but our project was about women's and disability sport. So we were saying, but what about your collections? Or that it just wasn't even on the radar at that level, unless the governing body was specifically a disability federation, for example. So that was demonstrating more and more to us that we were just scratching the surface of what collections were being shown. Because if that was what we were seeing, and we knew that museums were looking to us and archives were looking to us to kind of help that happen, that we knew there was so much more work to be done in terms of supporting, well, what are the other stories, and why should people trust the heritage sector to look after their stories and share them, and you know, why should we? Because we haven't been previously interested in either those people's stories or the sport stories. So there's a lot of work potentially, I think, to be done in terms of raising that kind of knowledge that we are trustworthy and we are doing this for the right reasons. And I think you're right, working with communities and ensuring that they own the projects rather than us has got to be the way forward. Anyone else on the panel want to come back? Is anyone reaching for the mute button? I'm going to go for Nick first and then Helena.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thinking about collections, I think one of the great things about sport, lots of different sports, is that if you've ever been to a football match or cricket match or rugby match, whatever sport, and you've bought a program when you were there, or you've had a match ticket to get into or you've ever bought a replica shirt and you've kept it, you've got a collection. And I don't think that's recognized enough. So some of the language may be around it, because obviously museum people, we talk about collections, and then you get that thing with sort of sports memorabilia and that kind of language. But there's so many people, football fans, whatever sport out there, will have things like that at home, which are to us collections, and that, you know, that match that they've been to and those things they've collected will have a story attached to it. Something will have happened at that match, you know, and yeah, so that, I think that's a great thing about sport, that you kind of have all that sort of potential resource out there and a way of engaging with lots of people.
Yeah, good point, Nick. And all those stories are important. Helena.
Yeah, it was just to come back to the sort of community-led almost sort of projects, and just to pick up on a thread from earlier with the Black Punch exhibition, it was called, at Liverpool. You know, I hadn't seen a project sort of based around sport like that, and I've been in the sector for, you know, sort of 20 years. You know, this was an organisation who I'd worked with on other projects about music. But it's like what Nick was saying, you can have your kind of national story about boxing out there, but the power for this project, it was that real local story. And it wasn't that these people only operated on a local level. You know, these were national, you know, sort of, you know, boxers. But the power of it for me was the, you know, their family, you know, they still had family in Liverpool. You know, people could remember the matches. People had, and as you were saying, people had things to do with it. You know, they had memorabilia and scrapbooks. And as a, you know, with my sort of Liverpool hat on, we didn't collect any of that. We weren't at that stage with that community group, but we were able to exhibit it for 3 months. We were able to tour that exhibition with the organisation. So we just supported them. And to me, you know, I hadn't seen a project as powerful as that. So, you know, I really kind of blew me away. I thought, yeah, that story kind of transcended, you know, racial inequalities. You know, it just, there was so many topics that boxing exhibition and story kind of covered. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, I mean, you can hear the passion coming out. And I think that's what sport does, isn't it? It is that kind of like, it kind of touches people in a way that often a lot of other subject matters don't. And it doesn't always necessarily need to be you that's participating or having any kind of activity in it. It can be part of your community or your family. There's lots of different ways that people are associated with sport. And the development of society, fashion, all manner of different things are cutting across where sport fits. And that passion of how it's, you know, you're able to get that message of that community and the stories that they're trying to tell and why that's important. Yeah, it's definitely coming out. What I wanted to ask the panel was, and I'm kind of asking you to do my job here, I'll be honest with it. So we're talking about, and we've touched on this a little bit, where is sport in heritage? How do we convince, because we're all kind of already aware that this is really important and we should be doing this, but that isn't something that I see across the sector as a whole. It's a very difficult conversation that I have with Arts Council, for example, about why sport is so important in terms of funding and the delivery of projects and programmes, just general. Not that they're not supportive, but it's just a difficult thing in terms of often those kind of people who are making decisions either at local or national level. So what I wanted to ask you was, how do we shift that? How do we start saying to people, these connections are central? And what are those kind of arguments? Why are they so important? What do we do to make that change? Anyone want to start? No one does, you say. This is go on, Foteini.
I think you just said it, Justine, before, that, you know, sport is passion, and behind, you know, sporting heritage and, you know, sport related objects, there are stories, and there are stories that, you know, can empower you and inspire you, and you can, you know, relate to this story, to, make your dreams happen. Like I did say that we have a lot of gaps in our collections around sports, but we have a lot of objects as well. And we do have like some, you know, very old historic objects. So we do have like a leather tennis ball stuffed with dog's hair from the 16th century that it was found in the rafters of Westminster. You know, we have, you know, Willie, the football mascot from the 1966 World Cup, and you know, like a red leather boxing glove worn by Henry Cooper in 1970 when he was fighting for the European Championship. But what I saw is I saw more people and, you know, visitors getting more connected to objects that we collected from the recent London Olympics. So I think it's because they had personal connections to that event. So like they probably watched it, they were probably part of it as, I don't know, a volunteer, or as in taking part, or as in, you know, somehow being part of it. And and we collected, again, objects from people that were part of this big event, because what we wanted was, again, like Londoners' experience of the Olympics, and not, you know, to collect the official, you know, story and history of London Olympics. There are other organizations who can do that. But, you know, one of our most, I don't know, visited galleries is the gallery that we collected part of the cauldron, and, you know, we kind of like recreated, you know, that experience. And to me, like, even now that we're about to close, like, it's all, I get mesmerized seeing how mesmerized, you know, these people get when they visit that gallery, because I think, like, everyone, you know, it takes them back to that time that, you know, they watched the opening or the closing ceremony, and you're like, oh, I remember I was, you know, with this. So I think it's, you know, this, you know, I don't know, narratives and these, you know, connections that, you know, make sport, you know, it's in everyone's life. It's very accessible, and there is always a personal story, emotional story also behind it, I think.
Oh, I mean, that's amazing. And yeah, the cauldron, crikey, you know, these kind of sometimes iconic things, as well as very relatable, personal stories from our own personal past. I think that is kind of the key to why these collections are so important. Helen, did you want to come back?
Well, I was sorry, from what Nick was saying before, and then Foteini, then I think that is the power of sport, isn't it? Is that it involves so many people, whether you're a spectator, whether you take part, the connections in it, there are so many connections. And I think that is, once you have a connection with an object or a collection or something, like, it really inspires you. And I think to kind of get more of that, like, it's kind of trying to get more people involved. So kind of going out to people and asking them what they would like, you know, going to different community groups, kind of going out and trying to find that different perspectives, like the different perspectives on things. So I think it's kind of trying, because it's such a big audience, there will be so much engagement with it, isn't it? And it's kind of trying to demonstrate look at the power of sport, look at the power of all these different sports, not just kind of football and cricket and rugby, but, like, you know, so many different sports and activities, and there is just such power there. And like you say, kind of trying to harness that power, isn't it?
I think that's it, isn't it? And making that that kind of argument really cohesive. And we're in a day of stats and figures, aren't we, where everything is about proving why this is important. And it's something that we're looking at. How do we encapsulate that more? How do we translate what's happening to people in terms of economic impact? And we're starting to do that, because we know we need to, even though we know the power and the passion of what happened. You only have to listen to all of you talk about your experiences to understand that these collections, they do this to people all the time. But there's still such a long way to go. We're still just touching the surface when we look at what is happening within the heritage sector around sport. And I think, Nick, you touched on it a bit earlier about within sport, there's a kind of recognition that heritage is important. And, you know, when anyone wins a medal or when anything happens, there's always a harking back to what happened in the past. And we're always looking at the stats of what happened in the past, but without understanding that irony, that actually we're not protecting that. We're not actually properly looking at what has happened, what has been the development, and crucially, what are the gaps, what's missing, whose story aren't we telling? And there's a lot. Nick or Helena, did you want to come back? Go on, Nick.
Yeah, just sort of echo what Foteini and Helen said, really. I mean, one yeah, and just referencing the sort of Museum of London personally, really, because I went in the summer to visit the Harry Kane exhibition with a lot of collections related to his career. And I mean, I specifically went to see that, but having seen that, I then went into the rest of the museum and you know, looked at other displays about London, learned other stuff, and I'm sure if I did that, that's the same for many people. So I really do agree that sport can attract those audiences that might not engage with heritage. I mean, and again, on a bringing it back to sort of Wrexham and Wales, we, as part of the World Cup starting on Sunday, it's kind of massive in Wales at the moment, because it's the first time they've qualified for a long time. The FAW commissioned some sort of giant bucket hat installations which all the fans wear, and there's one of those in our forecourt, and the engagement with that since it's been up has been fantastic. You know, people come to see it, and then they come into the museum, and we've got a football shirt exhibition on at the moment, and again, it's just, you can see that engagement happening, really. So yeah, I genuinely do believe that, and that, you know, ultimately, you know, if heritage is a whole sector, if we're not about kind of people and getting people interested in the stuff we do and engaging them, then what are we here for, really? So I do kind of believe in that, and also another point would be, I wonder, I might be wrong in this, but I wonder if at some of the really big heritage organisations that we do in terms of Arts Council and lottery and stuff, I wonder if perhaps they lack from people not having been involved in sport and sporting collections, maybe, and that would kind of help us to some degree. Yeah, I say I might be wrong in that, but that's just kind of a thought possibly on that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Dick. Yeah, and you're right. If we're not about people, what are we about? And I think we did a bit of research a while back, and what we found was a lot of the people that were developing sporting activity were either understanding that recognition of community engagement and, oh, this is going to change our audiences, or they had a real passion for sport themselves. And the people who weren't doing it often had a real aversion to sport. Something had happened in the past, there was a real, school cannot sometimes be a really unkind place, and if people had a really bad experience of sport, they were in the cultural sector not to have anything to do with it. And so there was lots of different things that were happening. There was also all the things around low and high culture. Oh, it's sport, it's not part of what we do. All of those different things, I think, is still underpinning where sport fits within heritage. And we're, as a kind of collective group of organisations, aren't we, trying to shift that and trying to say, well, of course it exists because it's central to what our audiences do and want to experience, so therefore it must be part of what our collections should do. But yeah, it's just trying to make sure we explain that clearly enough and have people who are understanding that as well. And I think it is shifting. I'm definitely seeing that change in terms of people understanding that in those organisations. Helena, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you think it's, you know, if you look at it and you actually give it some thought, you think these collections are levelers, you know, because people can't, even if you hate sport, you've still got something to say about it. You know, you might have had a bad experience, but that story is, you know, what would that story unpick? You know, about the way sport was taught at school, you know, the sort of, you know, I just think if you had an oral history, you know, conversation with someone about sport, and, you know, they're not going to spend, I'm sure, 30 minutes just talking about their club. They're going to talk about growing up, their friends, the community. You know, I just think there's so many other things that can lead on to. And I think with sport and collections, from an archive point of view, you know, they are paper records, but traditionally you get a lot more artifacts. So, and you can make really interesting replicas of those artifacts and get them out into schools, you know, so even if you took them into a class and half the class wasn't interested in that particular club or whatever, they're still going to get, you know, the history, they're still going to, you know, understand about leather footballs or, you know, whatever it might be, the objects that you bring into that environment. I just think there's, even if you're not into sport, you know, the stories that would come out of that are, you know, should be told. And I really like the point that was made earlier. We should be here as heritage organisations to tell those stories.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying there again about the objects and objects and the development of objects, often there's a lot of link between sport and science, for example, and you can see that shift and change if you look at what's happened within the development of the television and where that's linked to sport and how sport has made that happen. All of those different things that are sort of central to our lives, central to education and understanding the shift of materials and science and women's rights, all manner of different things that have touched sport or been impacted on sport or have impacted on sport. You can use it as a really good vehicle to help engage people. And I really like what you were saying about, yeah, of course, you know, I mean, there's a project there in the people who don't like sport, you know, that it's just as valid to understand why has that happened, and is that in specific areas, and why, what's happened to people. And I think all of those things are kind of central to why sporting heritage as a subject matter is where it is at the moment and where it will develop going forward. And so I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to ask each of the panel members just if you feel comfortable and able to, just to kind of say quickly, what do we need to do next? What is the next step, or the things we need to be thinking about to progress sporting heritage within the heritage sector? Would anyone like to go first, or do you want to have a think for a minute on that huge question? Nick, you're smiling, so I might come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, one of my initial thoughts is there's a lot of money in sport at the professional level. I mean, particularly in football, it's one of the sort of conversations we're having at the moment is, apart from, you know, funders in the heritage sector, how else can we perhaps get funding from the project? And I think that's a big conversation, is trying to convince some of these organisations to send some of the money that way, and showing them the kind of value of what we can do with it, and how that can kind of really help them as an organisation. I think that's probably the thing that sort of came to me immediately, because it is true. I mean, there is a lot of money in professional sport, but it's making that case, isn't it? I think for people that hold the purse strings, I guess.
Thanks, Nick. Funding, yeah, definite, massive, great big tick. Funding, how do we support this, develop our capacity, be able to do that? Yeah, I think that is fundamental. I think there might be some arguments across the rest of professional sport about there being a lot of money if it's not football, but yeah, you're right. There's, how do we make that kind of how do we make that argument of if you're investing, this is the shift it makes? Who'd like to go next? Helena, go on.
Yeah, I think if I'm talking about the archive sector, I think what I would say is, don't try and do it on your own. Work with people who have collections. Don't have the thought that these collections have got to be part of your institutional holdings. Work with them, to get the stories out, and then just see where that leads to. Because they will be the experts in this, for sure. If you've never done it before, you've never worked with a sporting collection, the people that you're working with will have far more knowledge than you can ever have. And I think it's really important to capture that, and maybe work collaboratively with other organisations who, like Sport and Heritage, the network, ask for advice, so I think, that's what my thought is. I think there's a barrier for a lot of people because they don't feel confident perhaps approaching it, because they think, I don't know anything about this, but there's people out there who do. You just need to support them and get them to where they need to be.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, yeah, collaboration, partnership, co-curation, yeah. Community at the centre of everything that we do. Yeah, and absolutely, we can support and help, and we have our toolkit, workforce development programs, all manner of things, and be able to network people. And the more we can do that and help people to go, yeah, I can do it, the better. Thank you. Helen, shall I come to you next?
Yeah, I kind of a mix of what Helena and Nick was saying as well, what Nick was saying before about, the partnerships again, and how what Nick was saying about the local museums having a partnership with their local sports clubs and sports collections, and having it more as a collaborative thing, like with the sporting heritage in the armed forces, where there were different museums with sporting heritage organisations working together. I think that is just so important. Like you say, don't do stuff on your own, work with people, with different expertise, and just try and get the collections out there. But it's all about working together, isn't it?
Oh, exactly, that kind of partnership and using other people's skills and expertise to make it work. Thank you. And Foteini?
I've been thinking what we shouldn't be doing, and not so much what we should be doing, but I feel that we shouldn't create silos around sporting heritage collections. Like, what I would hate to see is, like a little corner somewhere in a museum that will have like the sports stuff. And I do believe in like the way we will interpret these objects. The stories that come out are not only related to sports. 2 years ago, we did collect from Arsenal FC the jersey that they made in support of Black Lives Matter's protest that happened in May 2022 after the death of George Floyd. So it is a sport-related object, but it's telling, a very different story. So I would like, to break, this silos and barriers about what is this collection about, and make it more about a story that will reach more people.
Lovely. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground in that session. So thank you, Justine, for chairing it, and for all our panel members, Helena, Helen, Nick and Foteini. I think it's shown that the sport really is that golden thread when you're working with communities and looking at community histories. It can deliver across all those agendas, picking up on what you were just saying, Foteini. One object can actually tell a multitude of stories, and obviously it's a key to bringing in those new audiences. This session is one of 4 hour-long webinars which are being recorded as part of this year's conference. There is a companion webinar to this which flips it on the head, which looks at where heritage sits within sporting organisations. So if you want to watch the 2 as a pair, they make quite good complementary ones, and there are 2 others as part of the series, along with 2 keynote speakers who are Karen Dobre from Lewes Football Club, a tiny club here in Sussex where I'm based, but doing fantastic inspirational work, where their men's team and women's team have exactly the same playing budget and resources at their disposal, the only club in the country to be taken that stand on equality. And also Debbie Cooper from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, putting sport within that context of the current funding landscape. All of these will be available on the Sporting Heritage website and on our YouTube channel, and I hope you will be able to check them out there. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.